Welcome to the InnoGuide podcast, where we share the works of authors and mentors to guide innovation. I'm your host, Bob Boudelier. This podcast, my website, my newsletter, and my community are focused on helping you discover the secrets of innovation in the age of AI. Since I don't rely on paid ads, I want to thank customers who bring me into their programs as a technical product accelerator to work alongside their teams, helping them develop products smarter and faster without adding risk, while bringing human-centered AI skills into their organizations. You can learn more at innoguide.net. In this episode, number 103, we'll be sharing part one of The Long Tail, Why the Future of Business is Selling Less of More by Chris Anderson. When Chris Anderson wrote The Long Tail, he was describing what happens when the cost of distribution falls close to zero. This reminds me of the Zero Marginal Cost Society book by Jeremy Rifkin. Businesses no longer had to survive only by selling a small number of blockbuster products to a mass audience. Digital platforms could offer almost everything, and the combined demand for thousands of niche products could become as valuable as the hits. AI takes this idea even further. It replaces the cost of creating, explaining, recommending, and matching highly specialized products to exactly the right customer, but creates a new challenge. It's no longer enough for your product to exist somewhere on the internet. Your website, your expertise, and the problems you solve must be understandable and discoverable by the AI engines people are using to make these decisions. In the age of AI, the long tail may become even more valuable, but only for the companies that make themselves easy to find, easy to understand, and easy for both people and machines to trust. So keep this in mind as Chris cites internet applications from 10 to 15 years ago, but how his ideas are still relevant today in spite of the apps and tools continuing to evolve. So that's how this book remains relevant today. Let's get started. We live in a culture obsessed with hits. Box office records, chart-topping albums, viral TV shows, these dominate our collective consciousness. For the past half-century, our massive media industries have been built on blockbusters, and we've come to define our times through celebrities and mass-market products. But here's what's been changing. Hits are starting to rule less. Just look at the numbers. Most best-selling albums were recorded in the 70s and 80s. Hollywood box office revenue dropped over 6% in 2005. Network TV loses audience to hundreds of niche cable channels every single year. Of course, cable channels are now losing to internet channels. Young men are abandoning television altogether for the internet and video games, and the top TV show today wouldn't have cracked the top 10 in 1970. He says this: the difference between his teenage years back then versus a 16-year-old like Ben growing up today is simple: choice. I was limited to whatever broadcast reached my area. Ben has unlimited access to everything, as do we all. Anime downloaded by a BitTorrent, fan-created Star Wars films with professional special effects, indie music shared among friends, and countless niche communities online. The economics have fundamentally shifted. Broadcast efficiently delivered one show to millions. The internet does the opposite. It delivers millions of options to each person, and this shatters the mainstream into infinite cultural shards. He says, I'll never forget when I first heard 98% of a digital music service's inventory sold at least occasionally. He was stunned by this, defied everything he understood about retail economics. The company's executive explained that as they expanded far beyond typical record store inventory into niche and subculture categories, the demand didn't dry up. Those small sales, the onesies and twosies, added up significantly because storing and delivering digital hits costs almost nothing. So this revealed a fundamental truth. In a world of unlimited shelf space and zero storage costs, the aggregate market for non-hits is enormous. Traditional retail demands hits because physical space is expensive. Shelf inventory must turn over a certain number of times a year to justify rent and overhead. But online, the economics completely flip. Suddenly, products selling just a few units quarterly become viable. He tested this across the digital entertainment industry. iTunes found that all million tracks had sold at least once. Netflix discovered that 95% of its DVDs rented quarterly. And Amazon's data showed 98% of its top 100,000 books sold regularly. Pattern was universal. When he graphed Rhapsody's customer data, he saw something remarkable too. A demand curve unlike any traditional retail curve. It started with blockbuster hits, but never flattened to zero. Even the 400,000th track showed downloads. This long-tail distribution became his framework for understanding digital economics. We're entering an era where the vast majority of content, non-hits that were previously invisible, becomes economically viable and increasingly accessible. The mass market is fragmenting into a mass of niches. Rather than focusing on hits, the real market opportunity lies in that extended tail of niches. This is the economic story of our time. He starts with a story about how the internet fundamentally changed what we buy and why we buy it. In 1988, British climber Joe Simpson wrote Touching the Void, a gripping account of survival in the Peruvian Andes. It had good reviews but faded into obscurity. Then, what happened? When John Krakauer's Into Thin Air became a publishing sensation a decade later, Simpson's forgotten book suddenly roared back to life, outselling Krakauer's book 2-1 by 2004. How? Online word of mouth and algorithms. Amazon readers who bought Into Thin Air discovered Simpson's book through reviews and recommendations. The website software detected the pattern and promoted them as a pair, creating an entire phenomenon that resurrected a nearly out-of-print book. This reveals an entirely new economic model for entertainment. Netflix, iTunes, and Rhapsody showed us that unlimited digital shelf space lets people venture far beyond blockbusters into niches they didn't know they wanted. For a century, we've suffered what he calls the tyranny of locality. A movie theater needed 1,500 viewers in 2 weeks to justify showing a film. A record store needed to sell 4 CDs per year for a half-inch of shelf space. These constraints meant retailers carried only hits, content with mass approval. But now we're entering a world of abundance. Online retailers like Rhapsody offer 4 million tracks. While hits dominate, those overlooked songs still get downloaded thousands of times monthly. Individually small, but collectively they represent nearly a quarter of all sales. Welcome to the long tail, where niches matter as much as hits. So what about this long tail, those millions of songs, books, and products that seem obscure individually, but collectively represent a massive market force? Back then, Rhapsody streamed over 16 million downloads monthly, from ranked 100,000 to 800,000, songs you'd never find in a Walmart. Yet virtually every single track sells. Compare this to traditional retail like Walmart. They stock fewer than 60,000 music titles, while Rhapsody carries over 4 million. More than 99% of music albums aren't available at Walmart at all. This reveals a fundamental truth about modern commerce. When you eliminate the constraints of physical shelf space, demand follows supply. Netflix, Amazon, and Rhapsody now earn between a quarter and half of their revenues from products unavailable in traditional stores, and that percentage grows every year. The economics have fundamentally shifted. Digital products need no shelf space, no manufacturing costs, and minimal distribution fees. A niche product sold carries identical margins to a hit single. For the first time in history, popularity no longer holds a monopoly on profitability. The hidden majority has finally emerged. So, think back, before the Industrial Revolution, culture was fragmented, divided by geography and distance. But everything changed with urbanization, mass media, and eventually broadcast technology. By the mid-20th century, we'd entered an era of lockstep culture. In 1954, 74% of TV households watched I Love Lucy every Sunday night. The water cooler effect was real. Nearly everyone watched the same news, the same shows, and experienced the same culture. Radio and television created the perfect hit-making machine, and nowhere was this more evident than in music. Your Hit Parade, then Alan Freed's DJ personality, then Casey Kasem's American Top 40, each amplified the power of synchronized taste. By the 1980s, American Top 40 reached over 500 stations every Sunday for an entire generation. This was the carrier signal of pop culture itself. The music industry perfected the formula. In 2000, NSYNC's No Strings Attached sold 2.4 million copies in the first week, the fastest-selling album ever. 52 people created it. The labels had cracked the code. Virile young men, scripted personalities, industrial scale replication. Album sales had doubled in the previous decade. But something fundamental was shifting. The same week the NSYNC album launched, the NASDAQ crashed. Over the next 5 years, music sales fell quarter after quarter. By 2005, they dropped more than 25% from their peak. NSYNC's record may never be broken, not because they were that good, but because an entire era of manufactured hits was ending. The 20th century's fine-tuned marketing machine had finally stripped its gears. Back in 2008, we were witnessing a seismic shift in how we consume entertainment. The music industry tells this story the best. Between 2001 and 2007, while total music sales fell by a quarter, hit album sales cratered by over 60%. Think about that. In 2000, the top 5 albums sold nearly 38 million copies combined. But by 2005, just 5 years later, that number had been cut in half to just 19.7 million. Now, everybody blamed piracy, Napster, file sharing, all of it. But here's what was really happening. Technology didn't just enable free music, it offered something far more powerful, unprecedented choice. Those file trading networks contained more songs than any physical store ever could, and people responded by exploring everything, mashups, 8-bit Nintendo compositions, obscure tracks. Analytics show listeners now trade over 9 million unique tracks, almost entirely outside the Billboard Hot 100. The iPod, of course, accelerated this revolution. Suddenly could carry 10,000 songs in your pocket, an entire record store. Yet some filled theirs with legitimate purchases. But the real game changer was services like Rhapsody and Pandora. Music discovery exploded, but this fragmentation goes far beyond music. Rock radio dropped from 23 hours of weekly listening to under 20. Hollywood attendance fell 7% starting in 2001. Network television viewership collapsed as audiences scattered to cable channels. Even supposedly unmissable events, the 2005 World Series, hit all-time low ratings. Here's why this matters. Hit-driven economics shaped our entire culture. Studios and labels needed blockbusters to survive. We became obsessed with box office numbers and celebrity salaries, ranking top performers while dismissing everything else as failures. But that paradigm is broken. People aren't following broadcast schedules anymore. Instead, we're forming self-selected tribes around shared interests. We're transitioning from mass market to what he calls a niche nation, defined by passion and interest rather than geography. The water cooler effect, that shared cultural experience everyone discussed Monday morning, is fragmenting into countless virtual communities. And honestly, it's not a crisis, that's liberation. The long tail didn't begin with the internet. It's actually the culmination of more than a century of business innovations that quietly transformed how we make, find, distribute, and sell things. Think about everything beyond a simple Amazon purchase. FedEx, ISBN numbers, credit cards, databases, barcodes. The web didn't invent these things. It simply wove them together in a way that amplified their power exponentially. The real story begins in the late 1800s with massive centralized warehouses in the Midwest strategically positioned near railway junctions. These cavernous buildings made unprecedented choice and availability possible through bulk purchasing and mass production. Enter Richard Sears, a railway agent in Minnesota, who bought mistakenly delivered watches and sold them for profit. He moved to Chicago, placed an ad seeking a watch repairman, and Alva Roebuck answered. By 1893, Sears Roebuck and Company was born, and it changed everything. What made this revolutionary was the 1897 Wish Book, 786 pages containing 200,000 items and variations. For a farmer on the Kansas prairie, this catalog meant product choices increased 1,000-fold, often at 50% cheaper prices than local stores. Sears even pioneered viral marketing, asking customers to distribute catalogs in exchange for premiums like stoves and bicycles. But the American landscape shifted. By 1920, cities outnumbered farms and urbanization changed shopping habits. Sears opened its first retail store in 1925, and by 1927 had 27 locations. They'd inadvertently created the template for Walmart. Food retailing followed a similar arc. King Cullen opened in Queens in 1930 as the first supermarket, offering 1,000 products with self-service shopping. Shopping carts, automobiles, parking lots, and home refrigerators made weekly bulk shopping possible. By 1960, supermarkets carried 6,000 items. Today, over 30,000. Then came toll-free 800 numbers in 1967, which unexpectedly catalyzed a home shopping boom. By 1992, 40% of AT&T's long-distance calls were toll-free. This enabled niche catalog retailers using color printing to target specific audiences profitably, even with just 1% response rate. Enter Jeff Bezos. In 1994, analyzing retail categories, he noticed books ranked at the bottom, yet seemed mature, with superstores carrying 175,000 titles. But Bezos recognized the gap. While superstores carried only 10% of 1.5 million English-language books in print, the web could offer unlimited selection without physical constraints. Amazon.com became the first place where you can easily find and buy 1 million different books. Today, online shopping accounts for about 5% of American retail spending, growing 25% annually. The long-tail concept extends everywhere now, from Google's advertising to Xbox games, microbrews, customized clothing, and beyond. Revolution wasn't the internet, it was the infrastructure built to support abundance. So what are the three forces of the long tail? He says the long tail shifts our culture and economy away from blockbuster hits toward the countless niche markets. But supply alone isn't enough. We need demand to follow. These three fundamental forces make it work. The first force democratizes production. Personal computers put creative tools in everyone's hands. In 2005, music album releases grew 36% to 60,000 titles, with bands uploading 300,000 free tracks to MySpace. There's a throwback. Talent isn't universal, but it's widely distributed. The second force cuts consumption costs through digital distribution. Online delivery costs fractions of pennies versus dollars for physical distribution. Anyone can now reach markets as vast as Walmart's through platforms like eBay. The third force connects supply and demand through search and recommendations. Netflix, Google, and customer reviews lower search costs dramatically. When people discover diverse communities sharing niche interests, they venture farther from the mainstream, driving demand deeper into that tail. Together, these three forces, democratized creation, accessible distribution, and effective discovery, fundamentally reshape our entire marketplace. So who are the new producers? There's a moment in scientific history that captures perfectly what's happening across our entire culture right now. On February 23, 1987, Japan's Kamiokande 2 observatory detected something extraordinary, a burst of neutrinos, those ghostly particles that barely interact with matter at all. These neutrinos were a theoretical precursor to something spectacular, a visible supernova explosion. But here's the problem. While neutrino detectors can sense particles coming from any direction, optical telescopes have to be pointed at exactly the right spot at exactly the right time. And there simply weren't enough professional astronomers to monitor the entire night sky. So, amateurs stepped in, armed with affordable computer-guided Dobsonian telescopes and sensitive CCD sensors. Contemporary amateur astronomers could actually photograph the heavens better than professionals armed with century-old equipment. When Ian Shelton, a Canadian grad student, spotted supernova 1987A on his photographic plates, amateur astronomers in New England and Australia, Albert Jones and Robert McNaught, helped confirm its timing using their own telescopes. And when the neutrinos arrived roughly 3 hours before visible light, perfectly matching Einstein's theory, all these observers, professional and amateurs alike, shared authorship on the published findings. That moment marked the arrival of what we might call the pro-am era, where professionals and amateurs collaborate seamlessly across global networks. And it's happening because democratized technologies, those affordable optics, sensitive sensors, and the internet itself have transformed astronomy into one of science's most democratic fields. Today, NASA coordinates amateur observations through email groups. Projects like SETI, S-E-T-I, at home, harness the spare processing power of volunteer computers. NASA's Mars Clickworkers project had amateurs identify over 200,000 craters in just 3 months, and they matched expert accuracy. This isn't amateurism as a quaint hobby anymore. It's become a genuine force in scientific discovery. But this shift extends far beyond astronomy. Just as electric guitars democratize music and desktop software democratized publishing, amateur creators now produce content that rivals professional quality. And here's what fascinates them the most. They're motivated by passion rather than profit. We're witnessing a fundamental transformation in how knowledge itself gets created. Millions of ordinary people now have both the tools and the role models to become amateur producers. And the talented ones among us, even if they're a small fraction, are becoming genuinely influential forces. The long tail is filling up faster than ever before. Wikipedia is perhaps the perfect example. In 2001, Jimmy Wales launched what seemed like an audacious, almost naive idea: build a massive encyclopedia through collective amateur expertise using wiki software that allowed anyone to edit the entries. This broke centuries of tradition. From Aristotle to Britannica's professional editorial teams, scholars had always controlled knowledge creation. But by 2005, Wikipedia became the planet's largest encyclopedia with over 2 million English articles created by more than 75,000 contributors. Britannica, by contrast, had 120,000 entries created by a carefully selected group of experts. Now, Wikipedia entries aren't authoritative in the traditional sense. The Seigenthaler incident made this brutally clear. His biographical entry contained slanderous falsehoods. Yet, here's the critical insight. These systems operate on probabilistic logic, not absolute certainty. Our brains struggle with this because we want definitive answers. We want to know we can trust something completely. But large-scale systems actually improve through this messiness. A Nature study compared Wikipedia and Britannica on science topics and found they had comparable error rates. The real difference? Wikipedia corrections happen instantly. Britannica waits for the next printing. Wikipedia also scales to millions of entries that Britannica simply cannot accommodate. The real power emerges not at the level of individual entries, but at the aggregate level. High-profile entries show remarkable self-repair. IBM studied vandalism on their own Wikipedia entry and found it fixed in under 4 minutes through emergent curation by the community. While individual entries vary widely in quality, Wikipedia's overall odds of providing substantive, current information actually exceed traditional encyclopedias. It's simply a different animal, messier at the micro scale, but superior at the macro scale, improving organically like a biological immune system. Under Britannica's curated canon, where authorities decide what's worthy of inclusion, Wikipedia simply keeps expanding. You can view it almost like a music service. The top 1,000 entries compete directly with professional encyclopedias on quality and currency. The middle entries, from 1,000 to 120,000, actually surpass professionals in depth and comprehensiveness. And the tail, 120,000 to 1,000,000 entries, covers subjects no other encyclopedia would ever attempt, from obscure scientific topics to deeply niche interests. This raises a fascinating question. Why create without payment? The answer reveals the long tail's real economic complexity. At the head, traditional monetary incentives dominate, but down in the tail, where digital technology has reduced production costs to nearly zero, reputation becomes the currency. Tim Wu calls this exposure culture, where attribution matters more than copyright enforcement. This explains why creators embrace free distribution through the Creative Commons licenses, using them as marketing for speaking fees, consulting work, or academic impact. Publishing reflects this same shift. Nearly 98% of books sell fewer than 5,000 copies, yet new platforms like Lulu enable authors to self-publish affordably through print-on-demand technology. These authors aren't chasing bestseller status. They're distributing messages to niche audiences who matter to them. As Barnes & Noble's CEO noted, the very definition of published is evolving. South Korea's Omi News demonstrates citizen journalism's viability. 60,000 amateur volunteers produce 2/3 of the content, screened by just 65 professionals. The distinction between professional and amateur producers is increasingly blurring. So what drives creators in the long tail? It's rarely money. A Digg, D-I-G-G contributor who gets a front-page article earns about $20. Yet they write to change the world. When the tools of creation become cheap and talent distributes widely, the long tail becomes a crucible where ideas form before evolving commercially. Consider The Lonely Island, 3 high school friends rejected by traditional entertainment gatekeepers who launched a website making comedy videos. Their white boy rap parodies went viral, eventually catching Tina Fey and Lorne Michaels' attention. They joined SNL. They performed a Narnia sketch that NBC initially dismissed until viewers uploaded it online, creating 200-fold traffic surge to the SNL website. System adapted, and this perfectly illustrates what Barry Diller dismissed. 18 million people producing stuff. But the internet enables quirky, niche content that resonates with audiences better than formula-driven blockbusters. While 99% of blogs never gain traction, the emerging 1% collectively rivals mainstream media traffic. This mirrors punk rock's democratization. Cheap guitars and recorders made music creation accessible, proving you didn't need permission or formal training. Today's architecture of participation dissolves the producer-consumer boundary. Former audiences now comment, blog, and amplify content through word of mouth. We've shifted from monolithic professional production to a genuine two-way marketplace where anyone participates in any capacity. The age of the new producers has arrived. Boy, has it ever. So let's talk about new markets. When Richard Weatherford first imagined digitizing used books back in 1982, he was thinking decades ahead of what the technology could actually do. But 11 years later, by 1993, he'd made it real with Interlock, a closed network that let booksellers share inventory data via modem. It was a start, but it took someone else to see the real potential. In 1997, a former McKinsey consultant named Marty Manley was searching for an out-of-print book when he discovered Interlock. Suddenly he understood what this could become. Together with Weatherford, Manley created Alibris, which took that insider network and opened it up to regular consumers. And that's when everything changed. Here's the thing about the used book market. It wasn't one market at all. It was actually two completely different worlds. There was the textbook market, efficient and tightly organized, doing about $1.7 billion a year. That worked beautifully because of liquidity. You had plenty of buyers and sellers trading standardized items. Then there was the rest of the trade, 12,000 independent bookstores with random, limited inventories, generating only about $600 million annually. That market was fragmented and broken because liquidity was exactly what it didn't have. Alibris solved this by doing something deceptively simple, aggregating all those disparate inventories into a single searchable database. Suddenly, millions of titles were discoverable in one place. And when they displayed used books alongside new ones on major retailers like Amazon, something magical happened, a virtuous cycle. More customers could find books, which incentivized booksellers to computerize their inventories, which expanded what was available, which drove more sales. This is what he calls the long-tail aggregator model. Companies like Google, Netflix, eBay, and Wikipedia all followed the same playbook. Lower the barriers to entry by collecting distributed inventories at minimal costs. But here's the critical distinction. While hybrid retailers selling physical goods eventually hit a wall, there's only so much inventory you can store. Pure digital retailers have no such limit. They can theoretically extend infinitely down the tail because distributing bits costs virtually nothing. Amazon understood this better than anyone. They started with traditional centralized distribution, then introduced the Advantage program where authors paid a fee and accepted a smaller cut in exchange for guaranteed availability. But the real breakthrough came in 1999 with the marketplace. They opened it up to any merchant, from specialty shops to individuals. By 2004, over 100,000 third-party sellers were generating nearly 40% of Amazon sales. Think about what they'd accomplished. They'd created a distributed inventory where products sit on shelves across the country, but are cataloged and shipped from their original location. They'd solved retail's fundamental problem, that traditional chains must guess where demand will be, always creating surpluses somewhere and shortages elsewhere. Amazon disconnected supply and demand geographically, making them far more likely to connect while pushing all the surplus risk onto someone else. The ultimate expression of this idea, though, is inventory as bits. Print-on-demand technology means books and movies exist as files until someone buys them. But the real future is pure digital delivery, iTunes, Netflix, streaming services. When goods become bits, the marginal cost approaches zero, and suddenly everything, music, video games, software, becomes a long-tail opportunity. Well, back at this time, he talks about the new tastemakers and says this: the music industry is undergoing a radical transformation right before our eyes. For decades, radio and MTV controlled what became a hit. They were the gatekeepers, the arbiters of taste, who decided which songs would reach millions and which would disappear into obscurity. Those days are fading fast. Boy, have they faded. These traditional tastemakers are declining, and in their place, something entirely new is emerging. The power of word of mouth, amplified and accelerated by the internet. We're witnessing what I call a power inversion. Top-down messaging is losing its influence while peer recommendations gain traction like never before. Companies no longer control their brands. Instead, Google's search results and customer reviews do. The collective millions of individual voices now decides the message. Let me illustrate this shift through 3 bands, each telling a different story about how influence flows in our new media landscape. Bonnie McKee's story begins with promise. Her debut album seemed positioned for success. Launchcast, an early online radio service, revealed something fascinating. Her true audience wasn't adult women, as her label predicted. It was teenage girls. So the label repositioned her accordingly. But here's where the story takes a turn. Despite this targeted marketing, her album sold only 17,000 copies. Problem wasn't marketing strategy. It was more fundamental. She lacked authentic grassroots support. Free online access satisfied demand for her single, but that didn't translate into investment. Her fans weren't devoted enough to buy the full album. My Chemical Romance tells the opposite story. They'd arrived at their label with something Bonnie McKee didn't have, an existing fan base from their independent first album. This label understood this advantage and used it strategically. They seeded tracks on punk and social networking sites before the first official release. They studied file trading data to identify which songs actually resonated with listeners, and they chose Helena as their first single, not because the focus group said so, but because the data showed fans were already gravitating toward it. The result? Organic fan requests drove the radio play, which drove sales. Their second album sold 1.4 million units. The difference between these two cases? My Chemical Romance possessed real fans who spread word of mouth organically. Bonnie McKee didn't. Online reach alone isn't enough. Authentic community is everything. Bird Monster is another one. And Bird Monster's rise takes this lesson even further. This band bypassed traditional record labels entirely. They found opening slots by searching TBA on club websites. They built credibility through grassroots internet marketing. MySpace pages, another blast from the past, online mailing lists, MP3 blogs, and internet radio. This momentum led to opening for 4 major acts, like the White Stripes. Rather than chase a traditional label deal, they self-recorded an album for under $15,000 and used CD Baby to distribute to iTunes and beyond. What had once required a record label, talent scouting, financing, distribution, marketing, they eliminated through digital technology and online communities. This reflects a larger transformation. Millions of ordinary people have become the new tastemakers. Through ratings, reviews, and behavior tracking, we're entering what I call the recommendation age, he says. Netflix exemplifies this perfectly. Their recommendation engine drives 70% of rentals to back catalog rather than through new releases, democratizing marketing for smaller films. These new tastemakers include traditional critics, celebrities, power bloggers, and crowd behavior tracked across platforms. But here's the challenge. Infinite choice requires better filters. iTunes treats all music identically despite fundamental differences in how consumers navigate different genres. Classical listeners search by composer or conductor. Jazz fans follow individual performers. Others want historical context by ear. A standardized model fails them. Meaningful rankings only exist within genres. A top 10 list mixing adult alternative with emo tells us nothing useful. A top 10 Afro-Cuban jazz list provides genuine insight. This brings him to a truth about culture that might surprise us. Hits are actually rare exceptions, not the rule. Most content lives in what he calls the tail, vast quantities of material with modest audiences. We mistake hits for being prevalent because we're living in a hit-driven culture. But the math tells a different story. Most music and movies count audiences in hundreds rather than millions. Sometimes that's poor quality. Sometimes it's bad marketing. Sometimes it's pure random chance. This reflects what's called a power law distribution. A small number of things achieve high sales while countless others achieve low sales. This is simply how markets actually work. The long tail does contain substantial noise, but proper filtering makes this manageable. Unlike physical retail's zero-sum scarcity, digital distribution is non-rivalrous. Bad content simply requires better filters. Long tail has wide dynamic range, from awful to great, whereas retail shelves maintain narrow range. When you apply good filters, you discover that the finest niche products often reside deep in the tail, perfectly calibrated for specific audiences rather than compromising for mass appeal. We're living through a fundamental shift in how culture gets made and consumed. The old tastemakers have lost their monopoly. In their place, millions of ordinary people now guide what succeeds and what fails. But this new world demands something the old one didn't: better ways to find signal in an ocean of noise. That's the real challenge and opportunity of this recommendation age. For wrapping up this section, let's walk through an interesting example from the book industry. This was in 2004. Just 10 titles sold over 1 million copies, while nearly 1 million titles sold 99 or fewer. This really demonstrates what the long tail shape looks like perfectly. As sales volume drops, the number of products skyrockets. But here's what's crucial about this. As we venture deeper into the long tail, we encounter exponentially more material you don't want alongside what you're searching for. So the signal-to-noise ratio, as they call it, worsens dramatically. I'm looking for something, the needle in the haystack problem. But here's the paradox and the opportunity. We're shifting from pre-filters like editors and studio executives who kept us from seeing these things, and they were predicting what product sells, to post-filters like blogs and recommendations that measure actual behavior. In a world of abundant shelf space and cheap distribution, the real value isn't gatekeeping anymore, it's sorting. The future belongs to those who help us navigate everything that's now available. And of course, AI engines are helping us do that, and knowing how to get your products, your services identified by those engines has become more critical than anything before. But it does show that if you do a good job of making the invisible visible, then your chances of being able to sell your product to a willing market increase dramatically. So that brings us to the end of part 1, the end of this episode. For The Long Tail by Chris Anderson. I hope you can see how the ideas in this book, written almost 20 years ago, apply today. And I hope these ideas help you think differently about making your products visible on the internet, and about innovation, leadership, and the decisions we're all making in this rapidly changing world of AI. The goal is not simply to adopt more technology, of course. It's to combine human judgment, sound thinking, the right tools to build better products, stronger organizations, and more valuable outcomes without adding unnecessary cost or risk. You can find more episodes, articles, resources, and information about how I help teams put AI to work at innoguide.net. Till next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and stay curious. I want to thank Steve McIntyre for producing this, and I really want to thank you for joining us. I look forward to seeing you next time for part 2. That's a wrap.